Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I am here to help you sleep better with true horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like my video. I would love to know where you are from and what time you're watching this video. So please leave a comment to let me know, and I will draw from that experience to tell even better stories. When you are ready, feel free to relax. This time would be different from all the others because instead of an outdoor adventure, what awaited me was the scariest experience of my life. About 2 hours away from my town, there was a huge and dense forest that was very popular among campers, but fortunately, it was a bit lonely during that season, so it was perfect for me at that time. I had just graduated from high school, and this was my last week off before starting my college years. Time because all I wanted was to retreat from the outside world for a few days and enjoy the peace that nature provides before beginning this new, significant chapter in my life. However, what I would discover there would be completely different. That day, at around 6 in the morning, I ventured into the forest, and after 4 hours of walking through this rocky and uneven terrain, I finally found the ideal spot to set up my camp. It was close to a stream, but far from the usual trails rather than. Since there was a lot of vegetation and no signs that anyone had been in that area of the forest recently, I had to clear some area and remove enough undergrowth before I could set up my tent and build a campfire. This took some time because it was quite damp, and by the time I realized it was getting dark, I had to quickly get everything ready before the light went out. That evening, I ate a can of tuna and crackers for dinner and went to bed early because I was pretty tired from. I have had severe insomnia since I was a child, and one of the reasons I love camping is that, for me, the sounds of the forest at night are almost therapeutic. While most people find the sound of trees, wind owls, and wild animals prowling around at night to be frightening or anxious, for me, they are calming, and whenever I do this, I usually sleep like a baby. The hike and all the work it took to set up camp, as soon as I put my head on the pillow, or rather, the backpack I used as a pillow, I fell asleep quickly. In this terrifying and somewhat strange dream, I woke up in the morning and went to the creek to fetch some fresh water. However, as I got closer, I noticed a red-haired, curly-haired girl who was barefoot and wearing a dress that appeared to be from a bygone era. She was bending down on her back, collecting water in a small pot, and I got a little closer to her because I wanted to know who she was. After I was about 2 meters away, she slowly turned her face and gave me a small smile. Extremely attractive, with a freckle-filled face and large blue eyes. I returned the smile, but as I was about to ask her name, I saw that her face started to change in a spooky way. Her pupils darkened and turned a deep black, which gradually ate away at the blue in her eyes until they formed 2 black wells that filled the entire eye socket. At the same time, his face paled until it turned grayish-white, with tiny black veins starting to appear, and his mouth opened inhumanely, and he abruptly emitted a... I was abruptly awakened by a terrible shriek that temporarily deafened me. It sounded like a whistle, only louder and sharper, and it froze my body. When I opened my eyes, I noticed that I was perspiring and that my heart was racing. It had been a terrible nightmare. So I sat up and left the tent right away. I went to the creek to get fresh water, and I couldn't help but think about the nightmare I had just moments before. I felt shiver all over, but I quickly shook. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk around the area because I had never been this far into the forest and wanted to explore. I had no idea where I was going because it wasn't on the map of the area. But since I had nothing better to do that second day, I thought it was a good plan. As I was taking a quick walk, I noticed that very close to my camp there was a small path of stones that was barely distinguishable because it was hidden. I wanted to follow the trail through the undergrowth to see if it led to a cool spot, a small pond, a waterfall, or something similar. I packed a backpack with food and water in case. I ended up being out longer than I had anticipated. The trail was extremely narrow, had too much brush in many places, and I didn't see any signs of people like shoe prints or anything. I walked for several miles. It took me at least 2 hours to arrive at the location where the trail led, but it was completely different from what I had anticipated. rather than a waterfall or some natural scenery, I found an old cabin in the middle of the forest, and it was obvious that it had been abandoned because it was covered in moss and grass, and the smell of rotten wood was all around. The doors and windows were all open, but before I got any closer, I checked to see if anyone else was there, because this was not your typical situation. It is not something you expect to find a house in the middle of nowhere, and this was not on the map either. I went to the door and peered inside to look down the main hallway, and although there was mold and animal droppings all over the floor, the house was eerily furnished, with items that looked very old and definitely deteriorated by time, and undoubtedly by the wild animals that had undoubtedly visited it quite a bit. In the living room, there was wooden furniture that was covered in mold and filthy, including a table with 4 chairs, a wooden shelf that still had items on it, and as I continued, I noticed an old wood stove and a few shelves. On the floor, I also noticed a few rusty metal pots that instantly brought to mind the one I had seen in the girl's hands in the dream. This disturbed me a little, but I tried not to focus on it because I wanted to continue exploring the place, which required me to set aside my paranoia. I crawled through the 2 rooms, each of which had a bunk bed and a sort of closet. This section of the house was nearly entirely in ruins, so much so that at one point my foot went through the rotten wood and I nearly broke a leg. I knew I had seen enough and set out to leave right away before the place collapsed on me. But as I was ready to leave the old, ruined house, something powerfully caught my attention. A small shoe lying in the corner of one of the rooms. One of them was completely destroyed, and there was a pile of pieces of fabrics on the floor that I assumed were once clothes. It was made of leather and appeared to belong to a boy or girl no older than 7 years old. I picked it up by chance and couldn't help but think of the girl from the dream again. It seemed too intriguing not to keep it in my backpack as a memento of that unexpected and strange discovery in the middle of the forest. After that, I hurried out of the house and noticed that it had been a while. For a moment, I considered continuing the tour, but for some reason, I chose to return to the camp. But as soon as I stepped outside the cabin, the front door, which was wide open, slammed shut. This made me jump because of the loud noise it had made. I wouldn't be telling you that I wasn't a little afraid, but I thought it had been the wind because the door wasn't locked, so it would only take another windstorm to open again. I kept that explanation in order to be able to leave quietly, but as I had barely gone a few meters, I could hear footsteps behind me. Initially, I was a little uneasy because I hadn't seen anyone there, so I started looking around to see who I was following, but there was only forest. I tried to remain calm and continued walking, thinking that perhaps it was the echo of my own footsteps, the fact that I was a little anxious about the door in the house, and everything else. I walked for a couple of hours back to my camp without stopping to listen to the sound of the footsteps. It was 4 p.m. when I finally arrived, threw aside my backpack, made a bonfire, and heated water to make instant soup. I then sat by the fire to wait. And it was still clear, but it was going to get dark soon. At first, when I sat by the fire, I didn't hear any footsteps. So I stayed calm, thinking that it must have been my own footsteps echoing on the road. However, as I was eating my instant soup, I heard the same footsteps all around me once more, which was beginning to get to me. I tried to ignore the shiver that ran through my body and act as though nothing was happening. But then it seemed like they were moving the tree branches instead of just the footsteps. I looked up to see if there were any monkeys or anything to explain this, because if it was the wind, all the trees would be moving, not just 1 or 2 nearby, but there were none. It soon grew dark, and I was so tense and restless at that point that I made the decision to enter the tent as soon as possible. Everything was normal for a few hours, so I focused on the book and forgot about the previous business. However, at around 8 p.m., I switched on my solar battery lamp and started reading one of the books I had brought with me because I like to read a little before bed. When I heard footsteps around my tent again, I became restless right away. I had a really unsettling feeling in my body, and I knew that this was not normal or just the sound of the forest. But I had to have courage because I was alone in the middle of nowhere and couldn't afford to chill out. So, gathering all the remaining courage, I left the tent with my flashlight in hand and began to look around to see if I saw anyone else. I couldn't tell what was worse than that. I was haunted by a stranger or a ghost in the house once more. I discovered that no one was outside my camp, and the footsteps had stopped for a while. But when I returned to my tent, they resumed, and this time, it seemed like someone was jumping around. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do, so I just closed my eyes and began praying, pleading with God to take whatever was out there away from me. However, something even more terrifying occurred. I began to hear a laugh, a kind of mocking laugh, and the creepiest part was that it was a child's or girl's laugh. At that moment, the little girl from the dream returned to my mind, and I wondered if it was actually her. Could it be the little girl I dreamed about? Believe me, this thought made me twice as afraid, because if that girl were the demonic specter I saw in my dreams in real life, I would have had a heart attack if she showed up. Thank God, though, I was spared that night. The next day, I was awakened by the sunlight sneaking into my tent. There was no more noise, no more footsteps, and no more laughter, so I got out of my tent and hurriedly started to pick up everything. At one point, I just put my head in my sleeping bag to avoid looking at anything, because there was nothing I could do. I had no supernatural powers to fight spirits or souls in pain, and I couldn't escape, and I had to wait until at least dawn to be able to leave the forest. I discovered the small shoe I had discovered in the abandoned house in my backpack, which led me to wonder if that was the reason the girl had followed me to the camp. I was certain that it was the same girl from my dream for some reason, so I quickly removed the shoe and placed it at the base of a tree. After gathering everything I could, I departed as quickly as I could. This was the quickest camping trip I had ever taken in my life. 2 days was all it took for me to flee that location, and when I eventually made it home, my parents were shocked to see me so quickly and asked me what had happened. I told them that I wasn't feeling well and that there was bad weather. That same day, I started looking up information online to see if I could learn anything about that old cabin in the middle of the woods. But all I could find was the account of another camper who had a similar experience to mine some 15 years prior. But he was also unable to learn anything about that location, which is really odd in the internet age. There may have been a Maub incident there many years ago, and it saddens me a little to think that the girl might have been the victim of something terrible. I hope this isn't the case, and it goes without saying that even though I have returned, I will never camp in that part of the forest again, because I'm afraid of experiencing such a thing music again. When I was a child, there was an abandoned house down the street from me, and there were all kinds of spooky tales, and we children were certain that the place was haunted. The house had been vacant for roughly 20 years, or since the 1970s, because it was 1995 when I was 7 years old. This house was entirely different from the others in the area, because it was a massive Renaissance-style structure that, according to the adult story, belonged to a very wealthy man who purchased multiple urbanist homes and demolished them to create this mansion. However, at some point, I'm not sure how, but the truth is that he was shot dead in the house's study. His entire estate was placed in probate because he had no heirs, so the house was left empty. However, I'm not positive that this was the case. All I know is that the house was abandoned for a very long time and that everyone claimed it was haunted. Some even claimed to have heard voices and seen ghosts there. I recall talking to an older boy one day who claimed to have been inside the house, and he told us a story. We kids in my neighborhood used to play soccer almost every afternoon in the middle of the street, and there were satanic symbols everywhere, including a sacrificial altar in the center of the living room. Because of stories like that, we were all afraid of the old mansion and never dared to approach it. I know he was playing tricks on us, but as a 7-year-old, this scared me a lot. However, one day, I would live my own horror story in that house, though not precisely because it was haunted. That day, a group of us kids had been playing soccer all afternoon. I had just scored a touchdown and was picked to kick a field goal, so hard that it fell in a neighbor's yard. And then some kid had to go out to get it and bring it back to continue playing. Sometimes we had to jump over the fences, and other times the ball ended up going flat because most of the houses in that neighborhood had these metal fences that ended in arrowheads. It was a real nightmare, especially when there was no other ball. We had to drag it to use the structure that we used as alcove because it was stuck in the corner of the field. The team set it up about 5 or 6 yards from the old abandoned house, which was obviously too close, but kids don't always think things through before they do them. The problem is that I was about to make an incredible play when I kicked the ball, and it passed millimetrically between the old mansion's bars. And I watched helplessly and almost in slow motion as it passed through one of the glass. Knowing that there was nothing I could do to stop it, I put my hands on my head because everything was gone when they realized what had happened. All the kids made signs like, "What crap," and left the place, with the exception of the boy who owned the ball because he had just bought it a few days prior, and it was a birthday present. He knew he would have major issues if he did not bring the ball home with him, and he didn't have to say anything to know it. He was crying. I could have simply said I'm sorry and let him die at that point, but that's not my style, so I found the courage to approach him and tell him I would go get his ball back. But to our surprise, it wasn't. Fortunately, the lace curtains were light enough to let in the light so that we could enter without wasting any time. Soldiers going to war, knowing they would not return alive, we bravely headed for certain death in that terrifying place. We jumped the gate and entered through the back to avoid being seen by the gossiping neighbors. Could see all the horrors inside that haunted place. As the boy we spoke with had described to us, the satanic graffiti, the candles, the altar of sacrifices, everything, the sacrificial altar, and everything else. To our surprise, however, we discovered that none of this was there. In fact, the house was nearly intact except for the dust that had accumulated over the years and the white sheets covering the furniture. Once I realized that this guy had deceived us, I truly felt a tremendous curiosity to explore that place, but my partner was still afraid, and I was enthralled with everything, especially the old pictures. My friend began tugging at my arm, making it clear that he wanted to leave as soon as possible. Despite his insistence, I chose to listen to him, and we hurried up to the second floor, which was identical to the second floor except for a very sickening stench. Other than that, everything was normal and all the rooms were open. So I looked at some of them. They were very opulent and roomy before the search began, but aside from that, they appeared normal and not at all ghostly. However, one room was closed, and that was the one at the end of the hallway. Since we were unsure of the ball's location, we began searching several rooms, but none of them had it, and all of them appeared to have windows with their glass intact. It was then that we realized the ball had most likely fallen exactly in the room at the end. That was closed, so we went there without giving it much thought because we needed to get the ball back as soon as possible. When we opened the door, we discovered that the pain had gotten so bad that we had to cover our noses with our t-shirts. However, when we looked at the window, we saw that one of the large windows was broken because it was allowing air to pass through the curtains, which were moving in the breeze. We began searching the entire room for the ball, and when I eventually found it, it was lying next to a huge closet. A shrill scream came from behind me, so I turned to see what was happening. My friend was pointing to something on the floor on the other side of the bed with one hand over his mouth, and when I went to look at it, I was really startled to see that a man was lying down next to the bed. He was wearing jeans and a dark sweater, and he was lying on his side with one arm covering his face. He appeared to be asleep, but I couldn't figure out why he had chosen the floor rather than the bed that was directly next to him, and waited for him to move. For a brief moment, I thought that if we woke him up, we would be in serious trouble. However, after a moment, I realized that he was the cause of the foul odor, so I slowly went up to him, grabbed him by the sweater sleeve, and tried to pull his arm away from his face so I could look at it. However, it was too stiff, so I was unable to do so. But I was able to see a portion of his face, which I will never forget because it brought to mind the zombie films my parents occasionally watched. After that, I lost my temper and began screaming at the top of my lungs, "He's dead, he's dead," as I ran down the stairs at full speed with my friend who was equally or even more terrified than I was. We didn't stop until we were outside the house, and when we caught our breath, we realized that we had left the ball behind and that none of us wanted to return. In addition, we noticed that several neighbors had come out in response to our cries. After telling my parents what we had discovered, they promptly dialed 911 and everyone went home. Sometime later, as I sat in my room staring out the window, I watched the police enter and exit the house. As the paramedics removed the man's body, a police officer followed behind holding a soccer ball. He then came over and spoke with us for a while. We children had been conjecturing about a variety of terrible and sinister reasons why this person died. But in the end, it was discovered to be a simple overdose at the age of 7. This seemed like a huge letdown to me, and most of us promptly went back to our normal lives, though I had a few nightmares about that poor man, but it wasn't any more traumatic than that. And the others soon forgot about it and didn't. I don't think his parents ever realized how close my friend came to losing that ball forever. The event I'm about to tell you about is the scariest thing I have ever experienced, and I still get nightmares about it occasionally. My friend claimed that his parents had once asked him if he had anything to do with what was in the paper, but he may have been wise enough to play dumb and let it go. It happened 12 years ago when I was in high school. We don't know what actually happened there, which is the main reason Albert and I haven't discussed it yet. I met Albert in elementary school, and we have been great friends ever since. One of the things we have in common is that we both love exploring abandoned places, which isn't unusual for boys, but in our case, we took it very seriously. We were like two suburban Indiana Joneses, always seeking out new adventures and places to explore. This pastime began when we went on a field trip to an old, rundown house at our school for a history class. Albert and I continued to do similar things occasionally, but alone. I recall the first time we went exploring in an abandoned house in his neighborhood, followed by a few abandoned churches and even a closed power plant. But the police pulled us out because some local neighbors called them, believing we were thieves or addicts, or as one woman told us, an immoral couple who wanted to do their things there that day. The problem is that we had been discussing visiting an abandoned mall on the outskirts of our city for a while. But all we knew about it was that it was still under construction when the work was suspended. The reasons for this are unclear. Some sources claim that the project's investor ran out of money, while others claim that the state chose to halt the work because of irregularities in the permits. This mall was on the side of a long road, but the state had blocked the view from the road with a large row of trees, probably to prevent people from seeing this old dilapidated building so close to the city. The fact is that this building had been abandoned for more than 25 years. Albert and I were so excited about the prospect of visiting that we packed a few items in a bag and headed there using Albert's father's old truck as soon as we had the chance. The sun was going to set, so we had to park on the side of the road and surround ourselves with trees to keep passing cars from seeing us. Then, we started to walk because there was enough light to avoid getting lost in the trees. After a few minutes, the sound of cars driving by on the highway stopped altogether, and we arrived at the edge of the massive, deserted, and ruined parking lot where the abandoned shopping mall was. Upon closer inspection, we discovered that the building was much larger than it appeared, and this would undoubtedly be a fantastic piece of engineering. But what was most odd was that it was nearly finished. No cars, no people, no noises, just us. We stood there for a while to make sure we were truly alone, and then we entered the main entrance through the parking lot and saw that all of the glass doors were broken. As soon as we entered, it almost instantly grew darker. At first, we were silent, moving slowly and taking in our surroundings. Being in this enormous mall with no people or lights was eerie. As we were walking down one of the aisles on the way to the center, we paused for a moment to pull our flashlights out of the bag we were carrying because we had a weird feeling that every step we took echoed throughout the building. Suddenly, we heard something strange, like someone laughing, and we began to investigate. It seemed to be coming from the opposite end of the mall, which was completely dark, but after a few minutes we didn't hear or see anything else, so we both agreed that it had to be just another group exploring the area, which I didn't like at all because we wanted to avoid bumping into other people, but we were already there and couldn't waste time. In addition, it was getting late to head back, so we continued to move forward, and as the light faded, we switched on our flashlights and began to walk toward what seemed to be the darkest part of the building. As we adjusted the lights, we discovered that every store was completely empty, were deserted, and there was graffiti and trash everywhere. By that time, the sun had undoubtedly set because when I turned to look behind us, the area from which we had come was also completely dark. I turned to tell Albert, but he had stopped moving and was holding his flashlight firmly aimed at something in front of us. I whispered to him, and he appeared to be frozen, staring at nothing. However, when I looked closer, I saw that his light was pointing far down the hallway and right in front of us, and I also froze, standing by the store's entrance and just staring at us. I believe the thing that scared us the most was that this figure was completely motionless. It never made an attempt to greet us, speak, or simply move away. It just stood there, and even though we couldn't see its eyes due to the darkness and distance, its face was pointing straight at us, so we knew it was watching us. As the seconds went by, my heart felt like it was about to explode. We turned around and began walking quickly back to where we came from, swinging our lights constantly as we navigated through the darkness out of fear of tripping over something or someone. At one point, we heard footsteps behind us, so we started to go faster, but then we heard another set of footsteps. I said to Albert very softly, "Let's get out of here," and he finally reacted by moving the light away from that person or whatever it was. Footsteps in one of the side corridors appeared to be approaching us. We panicked and began running in the dark, but as soon as we realized that they were following us, Albert pointed backwards with his flashlight while I continued to point forward to avoid tripping or falling. However, even though we could hear the footsteps closely behind us, we were unable to see anyone behind us. We focused our flashlight multiple times, but at no point did we see anything, not even a silhouette. The craziest part of this is that as soon as we stepped outside the building, the footsteps stopped and everything was completely silent except for the sound of the breeze and the distant cars. Albert quickly restored his light, but we saw nothing at all. Albert and I continued running through dark, empty corridors until we finally saw the exit door about 10 or 15 meters away. The sound of footsteps grew louder and closer to us as if they were about to reach us, so we ran as fast as we could and left them all behind. Nothing happened. We paused a few meters from the mall's entrance and turned on our lights again, this time using both flashlights, but we were unable to see anything else. Since it was night and there were no headlights, Albert and I decided to run to the exit because we had to cross a large parking lot and a forest before we could reach the truck on the side of the road. We were so shocked that we didn't say anything. Word all the way back, and when the time came, we simply said goodbye and went home. We weren't able to discuss it until the following day, but we never told anyone else about it. To this day, nobody in our immediate vicinity is aware of it, but it is something we have never been able to explain musically. In the city where I live, there is a hotel that has been abandoned for decades. They had purchased it multiple times before, but each time they went bankrupt after a few years. I assume this is because the town is small and lacks any significant tourist attractions. It is hard to imagine who would invest so much money in a project of that magnitude in a city that receives almost no tourists and where more people leave than arrive. That place always piqued my curiosity, and when I was 23, I simply decided to go and take a look at it. Why was apparently never a very profitable business, and always ended up going out of business aside from the fact that this hotel was enormous. It had 6 floors and covered almost a huge area. You see, old say that it is the largest building in the entire city. I have been thinking about it for years, but this time I finally worked up the nerve to go. I chose to go during the day because I reasoned that if anyone was there, it would probably be innocent, inquisitive people like me who were just there to explore. I parked at a store that was half a mile away, and then I walked to the old, abandoned building to see what was there. After all, I felt that there was nothing frightening or dangerous about it. When I arrived, I noticed that the hotel itself looked much worse than the last time I had seen it. The bricks were crumbling, and the entire place seemed to be discoloring and decaying. I walked up the small steps to the entrance and looked inside the building, which still had its framed glass. The hotel was practically isolated on the side of the road because most of the stores that surrounded it had already been demolished because this was the oldest area of the city and no longer had a ZM. Commercial life as before. Doors, but they had no security, so anyone could enter and see it. As I mentioned, I looked inside and noticed that it was nearly empty, with only a few items scattered about, such as chairs and old furniture. I went inside and opened the door to the staircase, which was completely dark and had very little light coming in. The only light I could see was a dim beam from one of the upper floors, but it was enough to guide me to the flow, open the door, and enter the hallway, which was probably the creepiest situation I've encountered today. The hallway was dark and musty, with only a small window at each end to light it up. I walked a little before entering the first room, which had the door open strangely. When I got to the second floor, however, something on the opposite side was blocking it from opening, and a sheet of wood covered the window of the door. It was unfortunate, but I chose to continue to the third floor. Although it appeared somewhat fossilized, it appeared to be fairly normal, with layers of dust covering everything and all the furniture upstairs as if it had never been moved. I also noticed that several rooms had unlocked doors, so I went into a few of them and was surprised to find that many of them were intact, just like the first one I saw. It's as though no one has touched them since the hotel closed. But that is impossible. I heard someone turn the knob on the door to the hallway as I was making my way back, but I wasn't sure if it was coming from the floor I was on or the floor below, because if someone was opening that door, they must have gone up the stairs first. Fortunately, I had checked all the rooms on that floor and decided to head back to the stairs to go up to the next floor, because many people, like me, came to the old hotel to explore it. Apparently, they were also civilized. As I kept my eyes on the door, I noticed that it started to open slowly, making that sound so characteristic of wooden doors when opening, but because it was so dark, I was unable to tell who was behind it. As the door opened, my expectations grew, hoping it was just another curious visitor like me, but no. The steps were iron, and because the building was completely empty, every time you go up a step, your footsteps rumble and are heard very clearly everywhere. The door was only partially open when someone entered, and then it was violently slammed shut as though it had been thrown with great force. My heart was racing, but not just because of the knock on the door. I could also hear slow footsteps that crawled across the wooden floor and sounded very loudly. It took me a few seconds to recognize the sound, but I did. It was the sound of a cane. The issue was that I couldn't see anyone I was standing in. I was frozen in place at the end of the hallway in front of the penultimate rooms, staring straight ahead as these footsteps slowly approached. I tried to control my nerves by saying hello, but no one responded. Instead, the footsteps continued to move forward at the same pace. And as they got closer, I could tell that it was an older person's walk, but I was unable to identify any figures in the darkness. The sound kept coming until it. When I got to the middle of the corridor, I should have been able to see it clearly if it was a person, because it was only 6 or 7 meters from me. However, the corridor appeared to be completely deserted, and all I could hear were footsteps coming toward me. My blood was freezing at that point, and I was unable to move. Whatever was in the hallway continued to move forward and get closer and closer until the steps finally reached me. Somehow they just stopped. I stood for a few more seconds, completely still and confused, my heart pounding 1,000 beats per hour, and I had no idea what was happening. But after a moment, I just walked as quickly as I could, crossed the hallway, opened the door, went down the stairs, and left the place at full speed without turning around. When I reached the street, I rushed back to my car and sat in the parking lot for a while. My brothers and I grew up in a humble house in a small Mexican town near the US border. Looking back, that was probably the scariest thing I have ever experienced in my life. And going to that hotel by myself was the dumbest thing I have ever done. I never told anyone about that experience, and I never tried to figure out who that spirit wandering the hotel halls might be. I never set foot in that place again. Family, a middle-aged couple with a 7-year-old son that my brothers and I occasionally went out to play with. However, things in that home could get really violent at times, to the point where the police had to step in on a few occasions. The arguments in that marriage were frequent, and there was a lot of verbal abuse. I recall that the woman left the house multiple times with her son, but she always returned for some reason. This situation continued for years. and eventually we all grew accustomed to hearing. There were screams and items falling on the floor in that house, but there was one occasion when things just got out of hand. It was a Saturday, and I usually woke up late because I didn't have school, but that day I was awakened by screams coming from the house across the street. My parents and a few other neighbors came out to see what was happening, and we saw the woman hurling her belongings out of the house and yelling obscenities at her husband. It appears that she discovered the situation. She went out every morning to water the garden in front of her house, but everyone thought she was too depressed to be watering plants. On Monday morning, the husband returned to the house as usual, likely with the intention of making amends. This was a little strange because Mrs. Claudia went crazy when her husband was with another woman and had another family. The man eventually took his belongings and left the house after the incident. But she locked herself in Finn, and we didn't see her again for a few days. Mr. Leandro knocked multiple times to make amends with his wife, but no one answered. He then decided to force the door open, which is when he discovered one of the most horrifying scenes I can recall. 2 bodies hanging from the ceiling in the living room of the house, one of his wife's and his 7-year-old son's. The man emerged from the house, screaming frantically and sobbing in desperation. We all went outside to check on him at that point, but it wasn't necessary. This incident had a significant effect on the community because he had left the door open, allowing us to observe the macabre scene from outside. However, it was most devastating for Mr. Leandro, who 3 days later did the same thing as his wife in the same location. This is one of the most unsettling memories I have of my early years in my small town. Following this sad and terrifying incident, the house was vacant for a long time until a family moved in 5 years later. The tragedy rented the property, but they didn't even stay a week because they didn't know what had happened. The real estate agency didn't tell them, and when they did, they left it right away after hearing from the neighbors. That was 30 years ago, and although it had a significant impact on the town at the time, it was forgotten and hardly ever discussed until a few months ago, when this terrible story came back into the public, because of a terrifying event that featured my children and my nephews as the main characters. Last December, I invited all of my siblings to spend Christmas at my house. My family is large. I have 7 siblings, 15 nieces and nephews, and 2 sons. My sons and nephews are all around the same age, between 12 and 18, and as you may know, kids do a lot of dumb things at that age. On Christmas Eve, we all celebrated together and had a great time, while the adults had a few drinks and enjoyed the evening dancing and chatting. The children were having a great time playing with their neighbors on the street, while the older children were interacting with children their own age. However, the older children went to bed at around 2 in the morning. Although my town is quite quiet, the younger ones stayed up playing video games and enjoying themselves with one another. Despite this, we told them to stay inside the house the following morning, but we were startled by a flurry of cries and screaming that could be heard in the middle of the street. So I hastily got up and left. When I arrived at the door, I saw my oldest son and a few of my nephews making a lot of noise in the street. They were crying in terror, and the girls were yelling uncontrollably. I hurried outside to see what was going on, but as I did, I noticed that the front door of the old, abandoned house was wide open, and they were directly in front of it. I hurried over and asked them what had happened, and they started telling me, still in desperation, that night after we went to bed, they had taken a few bottles of tequila from the ones that were still on the table and slipped out of the house to drink without us noticing, as if the drunkenness and alcohol breath could be covered up. However, my nephews, who are not from here, chose to sneak in through one of the windows to have their little party there after realizing that the house was deserted. To continue the story, my oldest nephew claimed that after having a few drinks, they became inebriated and immediately fell asleep on the floor of the living room. But when they woke up that morning, they saw a very scary scene. 3 bodies, a man, a woman, and a child, were hanging from the ceiling directly above them. The boys went out into the street, screaming and crying, telling their neighbors what they had seen and calling the police. However, they were unaware that this did not occur that night, but rather that it occurred 35 years ago. and that these were not people from flesh and bones. After telling the children this story, we all went to the house with lots of candles and formed a prayer circle to help my former neighbors' souls finally find eternal peace. It seems that they're still bound to this world, to which they no longer belong, but they discovered this when they left and turned around to find nothing there. I hope your day is filled with health and joy. I invite you to subscribe to my channel to hear true horror stories. Hello, and see you again.